Moises, thank you for being with us. I'm very excited about this conversation because I have to say your book is the most important book I've read, certainly in the last year. And the book lays forward a reason why power of all kinds has dissipated over the course of the last few decades. Explain your thesis.
Well, first, thanks for saying that it's a good book. The thesis is that power is not just dissipating, power is decaying. And by that I mean that people that now have power can do less with that power than their predecessors. And that is true in the Vatican and the Pentagon. It's true in corporate life, and it's in banks. It's true in the military, in international relations. Everywhere that you look, where power is a currency, power is now degraded. And essentially, the central theme of the book is that power has become easier to acquire, harder to use, and easier to lose. And that is happening everywhere geographically and everywhere functionally.
Easier to acquire, harder to maintain, easier to lose. Why is that happening?
Essentially, in order to retain power, you have to have something unique that shields you from the rivals that want to take part of your power or all of your power, that want to dislodge you, or the pushback from the objects of your power. And so what's happening is a massive decline of the shields that protect the powerful from the pushback of the subjects of power and the challenges of rivals. The barriers to power are now less protective to the powerful.
Yeah, now I want to take it into the corporate realm in a moment, but let's stick with politics for a second, because we do live at a moment in time when you have a leader in China, as discussed earlier, Xi Jinping, who is referred to as the most powerful leader in that country in decades. You have Vladimir Putin with a strong hand in Russia. So it's not clear to me, looking at those two examples, that power is deteriorating.
I would never argue that the world doesn't have still important concentrations of power. And those two are good examples, and you can also, in the corporate world, it would be foolish to argue that Larry Page, who you interviewed, is not a powerful person, or Jamie Dimon is going to be here, or people at Goldman Sachs, or the big banks and the big companies, or the countries and leaders, political leaders like Xi Jinping and Putin are not powerful. That's not the point. The point is that if you look at what's happening, the trend to the power is a different picture. Putin today has less power than Putin 5 years ago. And 5 years ago, he had less power than 10 years ago. So the trend is declining. He is constrained by the economy, by sanctions, by a middle class that was unprecedented size and aspirations. And there's all kinds of things. And you can say the same about Xi Jinping, not denying that they don't have power, but what they can do with that power is more limited.
In the book, you talk about three fundamental forces that are causing this change. Describe the three forces.
So there is a long list of factors that are eroding or making the shields that protect the powerful more fragile, more protective, less protective, sorry. And I take the long list of factors and group them in three categories that I call revolutions. One I call the more revolution, the second is the mobility revolution, and the third is the mentality revolution. Mm-hmm. The more just captures what everybody knows, and that's the point that there's more of everything. There's more people in the planet than ever before. There are more countries, there are more companies, more technologies, more computers, more guns, more terrorists, more philanthropists, more, pick anything that has to do with the human condition. Look at the number of that 10, 20 years ago and look at it today, and you see that it has skyrocketed. And that has consequences for power. Then it's not just that we have more of everything, but the more we have moves more. Moves digitally, but also physically, goods and services and money and products and people and ideas and political parties and philanthropists and terrorists. Everything moves more. And then there is the mentality revolution. We have a profound change in expectations, aspirations, propensities, dislikes. And all of this is documented with numbers. The more revolution then overwhelms the barriers that protect the powerful. The mobility revolution helps challengers circumvent the barriers, and the mentality revolution is undermining the barriers. Put them together, shake them, and you end up with a world where power is easier to acquire, harder to use.
And this is why you see what you see on Tahrir Square. You see, I assume you eventually think the same sorts of things will happen in China and Russia?
And that is what I see at this conference. Each one of the sessions here had an implications that confirms what I'm describing. Think about John Chambers the first day saying 40% of the companies in the Fortune 500 are not going to be here 10 years.
It undermines their power.
Think about the session we had this morning about digital money and what does that to the power of central banks and governments. Think about your list of the Fortune 500. You yourself wrote when you published the list that one of the surprises is how many newcomers are in that list and how many come from improbable places that 10, 20 years ago you would not think of. Many of the companies are not from traditional places you would expect to have. And the same with the list of the wealthiest people. They're now coming from different geographies with different sources of wealth, with different portfolios, with different agendas.
So at the same time, of course, we do see these companies grow up to great size very quickly, Google, Larry Page being an example. So it might be worthwhile to just step back for a second and talk about exactly what you mean by power.
That hasn't changed, Alan. The traditional definition, the classic definition that political scientists use is that power is the ability that one person or one institution has to get another person or another institution to do or stop doing something now or in the future. That hasn't changed. What has changed are the sources.
To do something that they
wouldn't otherwise do.
That they wouldn't otherwise
right.
do.
And there are different ways of exerting that, and in the book I describe them. I can either threaten you, or I can persuade you, or I can change the way you think about something in order to lead you to do something else. There are different ways in which I can exert the power.
So this is a conference filled with people who run organizations. What do these trends mean to them? How does it change the way they should think about their jobs?
Well, there is a lot of good news in this. I think this is a good news kind of story because this is a world that is less secure, less comfortable for tyrants and dictators. And it's also less secure for monopolists. It's also a world where a small company has a shot at challenging and eating the lunch of well-established mega players. In the book, I talk about how these micro powers that are new, have a different playbook, are able to really challenge very established mega players. So one of the implications for this is the dangers of being too good at what you're doing, which is a paradox. In order to be successful in this highly competitive, hyper-competitive world, you have to be obsessive. You have to be laser-like in how you look at what you do and do it well and do it all the time and all that. And as you know, that has the risk of leading to tunnel vision and lose sight from what's happening in your periphery. Because very often what we have seen these days is that the threats come not from your natural, normal, traditional markets or competitors. They come from places that you don't even imagine. And that is true in business and it's true in every, think about ISIS. The Pentagon was not really thinking about ISIS when they developed all of the weapon systems that they have. Think about, an interesting contrast is Kodak and Instagram. Do you imagine a board of directors of Kodak in which you would say, in the 21st century, photography and pictures is going to be dominated by an app? That came out of nowhere. So peripheral vision is very important, and it can be lost. And, a conference like this helps broaden perspectives, I think.
That is why we do it. And it's very interesting because your comment, the contradiction between the obsessive focus and the peripheral vision takes us back to where we started on Monday when Don Barton, the global managing partner of McKinsey, at a breakfast Monday morning said, sometimes I wish that one eye was a microscope and the other eye was a telescope. And I think he was getting at the same thing you're talking about. I'd like to tie this into the last panel because Ian and KT are both in the audience. Can you bring a microphone up here? And Ian, I wonder if you'd respond to whether you agree with this notion that power is dissipating. Right behind you.
Well, first, I absolutely do. I think Moises' book is fantastic, and I think that this is an idea that's been, it's been percolating in so many different aspects of the world, and it's important to tie it together. The fact that you see rules doesn't mean there aren't exceptions to the rule. One interesting exception to the rule that I see is that the United States, in many ways, is actually, by virtue of its position, exerting an enormous amount of power in today's world, but it's very unilateral, and it didn't used to be. And I see this happening a lot, that in areas where you think that the world's becoming more volatile and you don't know who your allies are and everything's moving around and the actors are shifting, that sometimes individuals that think that they're in strong positions will say, I'm going to do what I'm going to do by myself. And I expect that plays in the corporate world as well. But so, for example, I hear a lot of people thinking the Americans are becoming isolationist, the U.S. is in decline, that could be an outcome that you would take away from Moises' book. I don't see that. I actually see the Americans being incredibly interventionist, but largely being unilateral in doing so. Here I'm thinking about drones, I'm thinking about cyber, I'm thinking about the incredibly effective use of the U.S. financial system, its banks, and the almighty dollar as a club, in addition to as an inducement to get countries to do things they otherwise would not do. And that interesting that can be more effective against American allies sometimes than erstwhile than it can be against American opponents.
What do you think?
I think he's right, and he wrote a book called The G0, which takes...
You're gonna send people out of here with a long reading list.
Right, of good books. I will take issue with just one point, Ian, and that is, yes, I believe that the United States is not in decline. I believe that, in the concert of nations, when you think about geopolitics, what matters is not absolute power, is relative power. So, when you think about the United States, you have to compare that to the others. But concerning the point about the United States' ability to operate, just think about what are the three weapons that are most disruptive, that have been most disruptive in the 21st century. They are cyber wars, they are IEDs, the improvised explosive devices, and they're drones. What do these three weapons, the most disruptive weapons of the 21st century, have in common? They are not under the control of the military. Anyone can go and have a cyber attack of some kinds, can be a hacker. Anyone can buy a drone and stick some explosives and make it a very dangerous thing. Everyone can use IEDs of many kinds. And that the proliferation of actors with the ability to do that, of micropowers, is very constraining. It's very constraining. The same, you talked about the financial system, and there's no doubt that the United States financial system is a very powerful, very important center of power. But just think about the proliferation of actors in the financial system. Think about the difficulty that the United States regulators have in making sure and controlling the international financial system. The more it globalizes, the harder it is for the U.S. to regulate it and to retain the ability to control.
KT.
Good news is I haven't written a book lately, so your list is not becoming longer here. But it also is maybe also a reflection of that I'm concerned about this micropower element. And you're so quickly outdated in the meantime because of the sheer pace of the development. Having said that, I think, yes, I agree entirely with the relative power aspect, but we are still facing typical elements of reactions on shifts of power. And that means clinging on or actually relying on things you might still have in your hands, which may lead to panic reactions here and there, but which also lead to, for instance, extreme regulatory issues that may come up because traditional power elements do realize it's gliding out of their hands. And what I've said before about this shift of traditional governmental power to some of the big tech players, in my opinion, they do have a new form of power here, which combines, it's like a public-private hybrid.
If you
power.
control the network.
Exactly. If you can control the network, if you can act in a borderless way, if you actually can also influence micropower elements in this regard. So that's maybe that's a point we have to see.
I think that's a very good point. I think the only thing I would say is you're right, but if you talk to people, one of the illusions that they have, or one of the delusions they have, is that they do have the levers of power. That some of the traditional ways of using institutions or regulations, you touch the button and you expect things to happen, and they're really not longer happening as much, and they don't yield enough, as much power as they did in the past. So you're right, but be careful with the illusion of thinking that the tools that have always worked for you in wielding power continue to be as effective, as potent as they used to be.
Moises, let's bring this back to the corporate sphere. Both Jeff Colvin and I, in the daily newsletters we write, noted this morning, without collusion, we both came to the same point, which was so much of the conversation yesterday focused on culture, on how do you get the culture to do the right thing. And I think that ties into what you're saying. You can't make people do what you want them to do. You have to get them to want what you want them to do. So how does that affect the way you run a large company?
It's very difficult because, as you CEOs here know, at points you have to tread very carefully and behave like a neurosurgeon and be very careful not to touch any nerves. And at next day, you probably have to behave as a tractor and just overwhelm things and be very ruthless in the way you use power. And it's the combination of those. It's very inconvenient to just have this touchy-feely, we listen, all I do, plenty of your speakers here had the touchy-feely message, we all listen. I am not really a powerful CEO. I don't do anything. I let everybody else do things.
You sound like
I am a nice guy, a nice
that.
person, and I let them do whatever they want. I am just an evangelist or a cheerleader. That's not true. That's not true. The CEOs that were sitting here are very powerful, and they exert the power. Some days as neurosurgeons, and the next day as a caterpillar tractor. And how do you combine that?
It's much more difficult than it was in the
because
past.
you have far more players.
We're out of time, but any last piece of advice that you would give people trying to run private organizations?
All of you will have shorter tenures than your predecessors.
That's it. Thank you. Thank you very much, Moises.